Okay, so I'm just gonna go over a couple things explaining how some quick ways to solve pedigrees. So there's really like 3 essential rules that you can use to solve pedigrees. So first one's gonna be asking the question, is it mitochondrial, right? Because mitochondria are gonna have this inheritance where when the mother's affected, she will have all of her offspring also be affected. So if you find that pattern, it's mitochondrial. If it's not, I call it something called chromosomal. This just means for me if it's X-linked or it's autosomal. Okay? So once you figure that out, right, you pretty much use this to rule out mitochondrial, therefore it being X-linked or autosomal. All these questions are made to rule out one condition, so you assume it's the other ones. Next, we're going to go over to recessive. For recessive, what we can do is look for something called a skip. We can figure out skips. Right, example here. This is just a quick example. So let's say this affected son has the gene or trait, but then we look at his parents, right? So he's affected, but let's look at his parents. Neither of them are affected. Well, if neither of them are affected, that's a skip. The way you can figure this out, is you can go to all the pedigrees, go to the pedigrees and go to all affected people, look at their affected, then reference back to their parents. If neither of their parents have the gene, it's a skip. If at least one of them has the gene, it's not a skip. Okay? Though I will say, let's say you have a pedigree like this, okay, where none of the kids are affected, right? But then look, none of the parents are affected. That is not a skip. That is just, they're not affected. They don't have the trait. That is not a signal of recessive. But this is the skip in generation, where you have an affected offspring with neither parents being affected. And this you want to look all throughout the pedigree, look at each affected child and reference back to their parents. Do it for every single one of the affected children and look for a recessive skip. If you can't find that recessive skip, then it's not recessive and you say that it's dominant. So if no equals dominant. Next, we go to our next rule. I'm just going to put these highlighted in pink. Stand out a little bit better. Okay, next rule is going to be, is it X-linked? Because if it's not X-linked, then it's going to be autosomal. Again, it's something where you're going to look for one, and if you can't find that, then it's the other. Meaning, you're going to look for X-linked. If you can't find X-linked, then it's autosomal. For X-linked, we can look at recessive. So let's say in the previous question, we got the answer yes. Yes, it was a recessive. Now let's look at X-linked. When it comes to X-linked recessive, you're going to look, generally the quick rule is, look if there's like a pattern of only males affected. Only sons are affected in the pedigree. So you see here, son affected, but no daughters. Again, down here, son affected, no daughters. That's going to be the pattern you're looking for, especially on tests. There's probability that it can happen, like it can happen a little differently in the real world, but on test-wise, look for that pattern. Now, you can have a mother that's affected, and in that case, if the mother's affected, all of the sons have to be affected in X-linked. So if you have a pedigree that, for instance, where the mom is affected, and then you have a pedigree where, let's say you have 2 sons, and one's affected, but one's not, there's no way that's X-linked recessive. Because she has to pass down her X, right? And her X would be X little r. She'd have to pass down that X little r. And that'd be the only way to express the gene, right? So there's no way that a child with this gene combination could exist with a mother that has X little r in X-linked recessive. Okay? So we're just going to do a couple examples real quick. We're going to look at this pedigree. Well, first off, we're going to check if it's mitochondrial. Okay, well, first of all, mom's not affected, so we're going to skip on down. We're going to go to the mother down here. Just look for a mother that's affected. That's the easiest ways to do it. Okay, mother affected. Let's look at her offspring. Well, one's affected. Okay, that's good. Oh, other one, not affected. Cannot be mitochondrial. So number one is no. Moving on to number two, we're going to look if it's recessive. Okay, so the way we look for recessive is, let's go to each individual child. So this child and this child and this generation, well, let's look at their parents. Oh, well, there is an affected parent. So this one tells us, well, we don't have a recessive yet. Okay, let's look at this side. Okay, this side, we have an affected child. Let's look at the parents. Oh, well, one's affected, one's not. As long as one's affected, means it can't be recessive yet. Okay, so next we're going to look at this child and this child, which are like the parents. We're going to look at the grandparents. Well, look, the grandfather's affected. That means there is no skip. We couldn't find a skip in this pedigree, so we have to assume it's dominant. So we're going to say no to recessive. Okay, next, number three. Well, since we know it's a dominant, right, we're going to look for dominant X-linked. We're going to go back up. We're going to see with dominant X-linked, we want to look for an affected male and see if all of his daughters have an affected trait. Okay, so we're going to look. We can start at the top. We have affected grandfather, right? We're going to look down at all of his offspring. Look for all the daughters. Okay, well, this daughter's affected. That's good. Okay, that checks out. Well, let's look at this daughter. Oh, not affected. Therefore, it cannot be X-linked, because his would have to be big R on the X, and then his Y is empty. And she with this presentation, if we're seeing the X for X-linked, she would have to be X little r if she was blank. We're saying if we assume it's X-linked, then she would have to be this. Well, she needs to inherit this X from her father. So if she's inheriting the X, there's no way she's getting this coupling of X's, right? So that means we know it's not X-linked. Okay, so the answer would be autosomal dominant. Because we know it's not X-linked. Okay, moving on. This one. So for this one, again, let's check if it's mitochondrial, right? Well, we have an affected grandmother. Okay, we'll work with that. So that means her entire next generation should be affected. Let's check. Okay, well, that's affected. Good. This one's affected. This one's affected. And that one's affected, right? Okay, well, that generation checks out. But let's try to go down the line, make sure there's no iffiness. So again, check every single mother to make sure all of their offspring are affected. Okay, mother, her offspring's affected. We have another daughter here, but she doesn't have any offspring, so we can't really check that way. But we also can check the fathers or the sons, see if they produce anything. Now with sons, if they're affected, they cannot transfer their mitochondrial DNA. So there shouldn't be any of their siblings, as long as they're married to a non-affected wife. There should be no offspring that have it, right? So no offspring, no grandchildren. No offspring, no offspring. So since all of the grandmothers was affected, and we found no sons that produced the gene in their offspring, we know it's mitochondrial. Okay, last one. Okay, so we're going to check if it's mitochondrial. Well, we don't really see any affected mothers anywhere, so we're just going to say it's not mitochondrial. We can't find any affected mothers. We can't confirm it, so we rule it out. We throw it out. Next, we move on to whether recessive or dominant. Okay, well, let's go through all of our offspring. We're going to start down here, the lowest generation. So we have an affected individual. We look at his parents. Oh, his parents don't have the gene. They don't have the trait. That tells us, yes, it's got to be recessive. So 1 is going to be no for mitochondrial. 2 has to be yes. And that means recessive. Okay, next, we're going to look for X-linked or autosomal. For X-linked recessive, I'm going to go back up the top. We'll see down here, right? We'll see down here. Well, it's going to have that sons, right? All those sons being affected. We're going to see that pattern. So let's look. Do we see a pattern where all sons are affected? Or at least most of the sons are affected, and there's no really like daughters or anything like that? Well, yeah, we do, right? We see son affected, son affected, son affected. That's going to hone us in that it's probably X-linked recessive. You know, realistically, we can't say for sure. It could also be autosomal, and we just don't have enough of the pedigree to confirm or rule out X-linked. But so this one is going to be X-linked. And there's still a possibility of it being autosomal, but we're going to say it's X-linked because that's what it looks like to us for right now. Okay. So on a test, it might be both X-linked or autosomal, but the more correct answer would be X-linked because that's what it looks like to us, X-linked recessive. Okay. So this is just a quick, couple tips to go over how to solve pedigrees really fast, right? Is it mitochondrial? Rule that out. That means it's going to be either X-linked or autosomal. Is it recessive? If it's not, it's going to be dominant. If you find a skip, then it's going to be recessive. Okay, moving down to X-linked. With X-linked, you want to look for these patterns of mother passing it to sons and then fathers passing it to daughters, almost like exclusively. Doesn't 100% work like that, especially dominant. Dominant can be a little funky, but somewhere in the pedigree, you want to look for an affected father passing it down to all of his daughters, somewhere in the pedigree, right? And if you see that consistent thing, that's good. Also, with this one, if you ever find an affected father, and let's say this one's affected, and then we had another daughter here, and she's not, cannot be X-linked. Just a little tool tip there. I know I didn't say it. I might not have said it earlier, but I just want to throw it in there now. Okay, that's all. I hope this helps. Good luck, and I'll see you guys later.